why you should be making your own games and how to. This is actually an infographic I had set up 5 years ago. A lot has changed in the past 5 years, but I want to catch you up on basically this fundamental way of thinking about game development is the same way that I've helped, by now, literally hundreds of thousands of people get into it. And so let's talk a bit about how this works, what it looks like, and why actually I've been revisiting, updating this graphic. My approach is rather than thinking of it first and foremost as a line of work, as a vocation, as a career, and for some people it'll turn out that way. For some people it'll be that way at a big company, a small company, solo, off and on. Some years yes, some years no, freelance, whatever it is. But it's always worth approaching game development first and foremost, I believe, as a modern form of self-improvement. Bear with me, because this is not typically the approach that you hear most universities advancing. It's not the approach you hear most books about how and why to program discussing. I'm proposing making games as a modern form of self-improvement. Many people learn to do martial arts, sports, art, and music, and few people do them as a job. But no one sees it as a failure or as time misspent if someone doesn't wind up doing that professionally. Nobody looks at the year someone played high school football, high school soccer, high school basketball, heck, even as adults, dodgeball on the weekends, just something that they do in their community, ultimate frisbee. No one looks at that and says, well, if you're not doing it as a pro, why bother doing it? That'd be ludicrous. What a worse world we live in. Right? We do it to build discipline and confidence, to express ourselves and to meet people. That's why we continue to do these things. And really, that's probably first and foremost more important than the throwing of the frisbee, than the playing of the guitar, than the maybe sculpture that we do in weekend classes. Making your own games can be equally enriching with the right approach. And again, I'm saying the right approach because there's plenty of other ways to do it that if you don't know what you're doing, if you don't go into it with a bit of guidance, with a bit of the right mentality of what's important, your priority, your process, I've seen a lot of folks go about it in a way that they burned through their savings. Seen a lot of folks go through it in a way that left a huge gap in their resume that they had a difficult time recovering from or felt behind thereafter trying to play catch up. So here then are my 9 tips on how to make games for enrichment and personal development. What I'm going to propose is the right approach if that's your priority, personal development and enrichment. First and foremost, remake classics to keep it easy at first. You pick like a 1970s game, then an 80s game, and so on. I've been teaching this for decades. It works. I'm not the only person in the world who's banged the drum for that, but I've been consistent about it and to see people get results because I provide them the framework and the systems to do it. Tiny, fun games with little art keeps the focus on your fundamentals. First and foremost, before you're worrying about whole new design systems and turning them down, it helps to just figure out how to put a squirrel on the screen, how to display text, how to get a mouse input to work, how to get objects to collide. These are non-trivial things with a lot of variety and depth in how you do them. And when you work on games first that focus on just those elements, it lets you concentrate on learning different ways to do them, to add those to your conceptual tool belt. So as you move forward, you have a better set of options to then complement larger and larger systems you're building up to. Because with the experience, you can start adding more twists and creating mashups, right? You start off with something pretty straightforward. You start with something that's basically a clone for the sake of practice, not to try to say you should rip off somebody else's design for sales, but just to make something, because when you look at a game and you do something unoriginal, you can't excuse doing the easy way out as, well, that's what I meant. That's just how I wanted it. You have to actually challenge yourself to say, okay, well, theirs did this. How do I make mine do that? And then each time you do this, you get more flexibility to riff on, to remix, to borrow back from. You have some tricks up your sleeve from the other games you've done. And each one, you start to put these new twists on, new power-ups, new level designs, new characters, new ways the AI works, whole new features. And before you know it, you're starting to build something that, even though it has a recognizable foundation and something recognizable as a familiar genre, really takes a whole turn of its own of your racing game, your space shooter, your puzzle game, and so on. I'm a big proponent of, you've probably heard this channel before, you can do more with Unity by learning it second. This is tough because lots of people see ads promoting how much easier Unity makes things. And Unity is a great tool. It's powerful. I use it. I've promoted it for a bunch of years. Released a whole bunch of games using it. However, it's a great second platform. Big games with Unity are easier. It is a great engine to work in. But like a calculator, knowing how it works helps you use it better. Right? Just because calculators exist doesn't mean you get to skip straight to Algebra 2 and Calculus and not ever have solved on paper what you're doing. It helps to have that fundamental, that underlying ability. If all your goal was to finish one worksheet, yeah, you could skip right to the calculator. If your role and goal in life is to do more with math, to do something interesting and worthwhile with it, to potentially find a career in it, it's going to help to actually understand the fundamentals. This is where, again, working outside of Unity can be beneficial. And I'm not saying totally build your whole engine up from scratch either, but there's a gradient in the middle between jumping straight into this kind of environment that expects you to have that foundation of knowledge, or trying to, do everything from the ground up either. So before Unity, what I basically encourage is just building some stuff that we tend to focus people on JavaScript vanilla on Canvas. That's a good level of abstraction where you're not having to tell the system how to play a sound effect. You're not having to tell the system how to load a font. These are things I had to do when I was a teenager, was finding and opening up code from books to how to import certain image formats. All that stuff, those are solved problems. But it still lets you then think a little more concretely about how the relationship works between textures in memory and in animation. Between, like I say, collisions is not something to take for granted. There's so many games that you've enjoyed throughout your life that have been classics that are timeless that don't really operate on the foundation of when two rigid bodies collide, a function gets called. There is so much more richness in the ways that we define our spaces and even the progression of time that get lost unless we do a few projects before Unity without it. And then it is about leveling up to a dream game, to start getting beginner errors out of your system on smaller projects. And this is good for a variety of reasons. In the same way some people like to find jams are a good place to start, it's partly because if it doesn't turn out great, well, whatever. They only threw a few days at it. That's part of what helps it be a stepping stone for some people who jams fit in their lives. Now, for a lot of other folks, they get this frustration if everybody says jams, do jams, start with jams are the best. They're not in a life situation they can jam. They have a full-time job. Some of them have kids. Some of them have full-time, if nothing else, class in a field that makes it difficult for them to forget the whole world for 48 hours. They need to keep a line to the world that's going on to be able to pick up and put down the thread. But you can still go about it by working on smaller games. And smaller here might mean several weeks. But it means to put a time barrier on, I'm going to take my beginner mistakes, put them in this vessel, and then move on from it. And that's possible partly because, again, we're starting out, what I encourage you is to basically start with unoriginal classics. To start from a real simple clone or two, but also because in the process, we're not as invested in it. If it doesn't come out great, fine. The world didn't need Space Invaders to exist again anyway. The world didn't need another Pac-Man. The world didn't need another whatever one of these things was. You were going through as an exercise because you had not yet solved the problems involved. And on the other side of it, now you know how. And again, I use my math analogies. It's like when you're solving a ton of math questions going through school, it's not because no one's ever solved that before. It's because until you've solved it, you don't have the foundation to go into the more interesting unsolved things. No one starts with a PhD in these kind of fields. Each game is like a stepping stone to try out new parts you can use. And this is where, stepping stone methodologies is an approach that I specifically am writing about my email list for part of my sequence that I share at gamedevtraining.com. But it's something where in stepping stone methodology, we take the dream game. We look at what is it built out of? What are the component parts? Does it need a mini-map? Does it need pathfinding? Does it need mouse control? Does it need touchscreen? Does it need to be supporting responsive browsers? VR support? Whatever it needs to support. Can I fragment those out and then work on some games that involve certain different combinations of it? Say one that has a high score system that sorts scores and saves and restores it. One that needs adaptive input. One that needs, some sort of sound system that changes pitch over time like a racing game. And by adding up these components into smaller projects, what's happening really is that by the time we get onto our dream game, it's our second or third iteration of each of those abilities so that we're not having to make our beginner mistakes on the thing that really matters to us. And that makes a huge difference. It's like a final boss, right? It's about going in there not with an empty inventory, not unleveled up. You want to get up your XP, you want to fill up your inventory, you want to get your whole army, your crowd, your party ready. So by the time you take it on, you go in there with confidence of you're going to finish this battle. You're not going to get sent back to the beginning from how bad it fails. And again, I've seen it really crush people's morale. So it's part of why I approach, let's build our way up to things. Tutorials help, but it is important to get to your game, right? Training wheels exist so that you don't need training wheels anymore. Training wheels are not there, so for the rest of your life, you're going to ride a bike with training wheels. And tutorials are the same way. The purpose of tutorials, of a good tutorial, is to make you not need that tutorial anymore, right? It's so that you can move on from it, so you have it in your tool set. And you may continue to go back and skim tutorials, borrow code from tutorials. That's different than the hand-holding that goes on of step 1, step 2, step 3. And it's why in my video courses, they specifically taper off at the end and stop giving you specific line-by-line instruction, instead showing in action, game did this, now game does that. Apply what I've taught you. You know everything you need to do this to get from A to B, from B to C to D. Game development's open-ended. And a lot of what's going on when you're really building original projects is you can't rely on the steps having already been traced out for you, the path having already been cleared. A major part of game development is this constant reevaluation of what we're building, how we're building, this kind of moment-to-moment, task-to-task opportunity to not just pivot out of something because something was complicated or got stuck or wasn't working well, but because sometimes there's no opportunity, you couldn't tell till you're halfway to a project. And you lose all of that practice, all that proficiency if you're kind of cementing a reliance on, okay, well now tell me what to do next. Now tell me what to do next. You have to equip yourself to be able to steer, and that comes from needing to get onto your game. This is also because tutorials are harder to get excited about. It's harder to be as invested in. When you think about how excited you are about a game that's coming out, you're looking forward to the release date, you're looking forward to the game being built, and you think about how and when are you going to be excited about the game you're building? Is it going to be because you followed a tutorial that 10,000 other people have followed? Probably not. Now, there might be a stepping stone, right? It might be something, again, useful as a piece of your own game. But really, what's going to excite you and motivate you and get you to want to try a little bit harder to solve some difficult problems, to make it do that cool thing, is when it's really realizing something that came out from inside of you, something that's more your own creation. I strongly encourage planning to release your practice games free. But freeware enabled us the freedom to practice, to make our mistakes, to try things that we haven't yet proven ourselves in, and there's a lot of room for growth in that. It lets us be resourceful. It helps us figure out how to get our message across with limited means. And in the future, even when we have more resources to work with, and we can justify more of a case around it, we have proof of traction of an audience or of critics and a judging board approving what we do, it becomes much easier to then take that same resourcefulness and use resources much better because we know how to operate without relying on them. It lets you focus on developing your skills rather than the separate skill that is operating a business, which is a worthwhile skill to develop. But this is the same thing true for if you take a woodworking class. They're going to teach you how to build things with wood. They're not going to teach you specifically how to run a shop that sells furniture. That is a different combination of skills. And among game development, if you're trying to learn both these things at once, they are both incredibly complex problem spaces. They're both worth learning, can both be learned, but I strongly encourage a good foundation of actually doing the craft is going to help equip you to then start processing separately how and if you choose to engage in it as a commercial endeavor. Like a musician or athlete, payoff is not a near-term prospect, right? We don't start playing music with the expectation of we're going to make our money back playing this from a stage with sold-out tickets. We don't start playing a sport with the expectation of, well, I'm not even going to get out in the court until people are buying tickets to see me perform. That's not how it starts. First and foremost, the payoff is primarily personal enrichment. The payoff is primarily discipline. It's growth. It's expression. It's letting us test our limits. It's letting us see what's inside ourselves better. And this is why I strongly encourage going about game development when you're new to it in the same way. Also encourage sticking to a deadline. 1 or 2 months is a good time frame if you're new and working alone. If you try to spread it out over years, and many times what I've seen happen is that they produce something that took them 2, 3, 4, 5 years, but the output is really not a whole lot better than what they could have done in 2 months because it got lost off in the weeds. 2 to 6 months can be better if you have a whole team. Any longer than that is pretty tough to release well, again, without diminishing returns and without people sort of petering out in a way that results in more bugs, more difficulty. There's sort of a natural springiness to that time frame. Finishing is valuable experience, and adapting to a release date is part of everyone's process. Teams that have $400 million wish they had $500 million. Teams that have $100,000 wish they had $200,000. Nobody's ever going to say, if you look at their schedule and they had 4 years to ship a game, would you like a 5th year? Were they going to say no? Of course not. Everyone always wishes they had more time and resources. Everyone's thoughts and imagination always turn out more potential than they can deliver on. Part of the process you have to practice is being concrete about what are your trade-offs, about how do I make the most of a finite span of time? How do I make the most of a finite amount of energy that I have before I've decided it's time for me to move on to the next thing? And that's part of why sticking to a deadline is a great habit to develop, especially while the risks are low, before it is disappointing investors, disappointing customers, getting bad reviews, etc. Draw or buddy up for custom temp art. And this is a huge one that I see a lot of people make a mistake of. They lean heavily on buying and finding assets. And all I'm trying to suggest is to aim for functional, right? You should be able to tell that's a plane, then you're done with it. You should be able to tell that that's a helicopter, go on. That's a chair, that's good enough. Worry about later if it's worth spending the money, time, and energy to do it all super polished. Think about this. If you were going to write a book, should your first step be to translate it into 30 other languages? Or would you wait and see if anybody's actually reading it in your native language? And then if they are, if it's popular, then justifying going to the time, effort, and energy to get it translated because you've proven it's worth translating. More people would actually probably like to actually read this. Well, the same thing's also true here, where if we get ahead of ourselves, if we first overinvest in high level of visual polish without having first proven, does anyone actually want to play what this is? based on mechanically what's going on, the navigation of the space, the way the player controls, the way we're designing environments, if this core concept isn't hooking people, it's a waste of time, energy, and money to get too lost into trying to get it too polished too soon before is there any traction proven from the functional representation that we just kind of, again, placeholder, something that works well enough. Binding or finding art limits a game. So even if you're just trying to do placeholder, if you find a really high quality dragon, if you find a really high quality character animated, if you find a really high quality song, suddenly you can't match that. And now you've lost control of your design. You've lost control of your game. You can't take one of those really high poly assets, one of those really top level creative performances, and then riff on it because you don't have the same skill level that produced it. It's far better to have consistency, in Minecraft is a popular example of this, where it at least looks consistent across. The simplicity is an active choice that's a thread throughout. It wouldn't be made better if suddenly they bought and dropped in some nicer looking tree, the whole thing falls apart. And consistency gets you a lot further than any single asset looking nicer because it's founder bought. Also, it gets past this idea that the answer is somehow outside of ourselves. That I just got to go keep digging long enough and I'll find something. And it turns it into sorting through other people's solutions, and suddenly you're building something more generic than what it can. If it's really you have the power to represent the ideas coming to your mind, that's what allows you to innovate beyond just snapping together pieces you find from others. And if people love how it plays, like I said, that's where you can then justify a relaunch, a reskin, further investment, fundraising, and other things that make sense because you've proven, despite it not looking great, despite it being a little rough around the edges, despite it being at a proof of concept level, people still fell in love with it, double down on it. But you have a good case to, instead of every single project, that's not usually the outcome just because you have an idea to try. Finding teams in a peer community. This is huge. People who do this far more likely to succeed than people who don't. Okay, it lets you focus on the parts you like most. And it doesn't hurt to have a bit of a generalist, to be functionally familiar with different things, but fundamentally, there's going to be something you feel you have more of a knack for, something that you enjoy more, something that comes more naturally to you, something you do more efficiently than others do, that really helps the team better when you focus a little more in it. Maybe it's AI, maybe it's level design, writing, music, sound, various kinds of art, whatever it might be. It's something that when you're on a team, you can actually concentrate your energy on that instead of doing a less efficient job of something that somebody else loves to do more than you do. And this also allows you to fit it around your day. This is something where when someone tries to do everything themselves, you read a lot of things online about people who are making games in a way that tears them up, wears them out. They can barely make it fit, and it's often because they're trying to do everything themselves. Think of it when you're moving an appliance, moving a refrigerator, moving a washing machine. They got that sticker on it that shows, don't try to move this with one person. This is a two-person object to move. If I could slap that sticker on game development, I would. Because it is typically not a safe thing to move alone. Now, again, there's a handful of examples out of the history of dozens of games that have turned out great, and people love to put them on stages and write books about them. It's not doing us any favor because the other hundreds of thousands of games that have done well, that people enjoyed, that have played, that they love the look of, that were made in a way that didn't put someone's house up for mortgage or turn their life upside down, were typically made with a team. It was made where when there's 5 times as many of us, when there's 4 times as many, when there's 20 as many of us, when there's even 3 of us, it's so much easier to share that load. It's not just the load of the amount of work being done, it's the removal of that task switching, having to constantly go from one thing to another to do the parts that are more of a slog for us to do. It also lets us free ourselves from the pressure of it sits still when I'm not doing it. It's such a morale boost on the team to wake up and see your game better than you left it, to not feel alone, to not feel like you're reminded of lack of progress because everyone else's progress is like a baton carried forward and it's encouraging. Meanwhile, leading and teamwork are powerful skills for anyone to improve at. And this is something we're getting at it from an enrichment angle, from a personal growth angle. Part of what I like about teams is that inherently you have to coordinate, collaborate, discuss, recognize differences of maybe you don't see eye to eye with somebody else. Maybe they have a prioritization on visual issues and why that's important. Yours might be more design oriented and why functional considerations are important. Someone else's might be engine optimization and why that's important. All of you are right. And it forces a situation where you have to come to some sort of agreement to navigate those discussions. And that teamwork is a skill that's going to benefit you the rest of your life. In any workplace, in any family situation, in any social situation, likewise for leading, where typically there's somebody who's kind of driving a core vision, depends on the team and the structure, but pretty often there's somebody who, if nothing else, is the kind of helping make sure it's staying on some sort of track, even if others are still super involved in it. And that's the sort of thing, that type of planning, that type of production, that type of coordination, that type of mediation between others is, again, a life skill. It's going to behoove you regardless of what else you actually study, do, may or may not have an interest in over the years. And then lastly, my encouragement to get professional, reliable support. Right? Just like we seek guidance for sports, art, and music. How many people who go into sports do it without ever having a coach? How many people who learn art do it without ever taking an art class or having an art teacher, or taking the art lessons? How many people who do music are 100% self-taught? Right? I'm not even saying music school. I'm saying even piano lessons, violin lessons, singing lessons. How often is that really the story people have? People look for professional, reliable support for those. If you get stuck, you'll want experienced people to turn to. That's something where this thing goes off the rails for people, is that they are working on alone. They have a hard time sizing up the reasonableness of difficulty. When you're new to it, it's hard to tell what's super hard and what's super easy. And so you get in over your head without even realizing that you're up against something like that. Somebody's an experienced advisor just can spot that and say, oh, that's people have worked on PhDs on that problem that you're stuck on, about what's going on with this dialogue system, what's going on with a certain type of optimization, what's going on with a certain type of rendering you're trying to do. Even just knowing that can set you free from, oh, I'm not bad. I'm kind of too new to recognize the difficulty of this task at hand, but this is expected. This is normal. And the relief that gives us helps set us free to make continued forward progress instead of beating ourselves up, which again plays back into this difficulty of, some people talk about game development as if it's emotionally hard in that way, when often it's because of the way that they're doing it more than anything else. Additionally, it's a person who knows you and who can provide help in ways the web can't. This is where, when you have someone who's a professional, reliable support person, they understand your situation. They followed you for a while. They know your background. They know what you've been through. They know the kind of problems you've solved. They can reference examples that don't just make sense to them, but that make sense to you because they were there for it, to have that context. And that makes an enormous difference in a way that just digging through the internet doesn't have that result, right? It's harder to get that for ourselves. Now, when I shared this years ago, I made this graphic, would have been 2016, so literally 5 years ago. I shared this with an industry veteran friend of mine to get his feedback on, there's something about the wording of these, the tweaks of these, what do you think about this messaging and so on. His feedback was, Chris, these look great. This makes a lot of sense. This is correct. However, let's be honest, those last two, about finding teams in a peer community and getting professional, reliable support, are basically impossible for people starting out. And this was literally his response. He was like, finding teams in a peer community who actually are productive and do things, and not just some web form of people who kind of talk about it and don't do anything, or getting professional, reliable support, which is either way out of people's budget, or who's going to take the time to help someone who doesn't know anything yet, just an impossibility. Now, in the 5 years since that person said that, the business that I've built, HomeTeamGamedev.com, we deliver on what he said were impossible for people who are starting out. We help people get the teams in the peer community who are constructive, who've released over 100 games together in the past 5 years. We get them the professional, reliable support directly from me at a far more affordable rate than when I used to do things 101 because of the group process of our group structure, in addition to now trainers in level design, art, audio, UI, and other specializations, including a couple of people who are career counselors for different pathways people might explore as they reach those levels in their pathways. And so this is something where, again, it's been built around, fundamentally, first and foremost, personal enrichment, personal growth, expression, being something that's worth doing in its own right because we're doing it affordably, because we're doing it at a scale where there's very little at risk, because we're doing it in a way we can sustain doing it. We can keep doing it long enough to accumulate experience to get to the dream game that we're after, to build the things that we're in it to do, rather than taking one of those approaches. We drain our savings on prematurely hiring out a whole bunch of custom art, a whole bunch of custom audio, prematurely trying to jump straight to polish, trying to jump straight to something that was a commercial project, which hasn't proven its traction, which we maybe didn't get the beginners out of our system to give ourselves a realistic shot at achieving that the way we wanted to. Now, back when I made this infographic, like say 5 years ago, I had first pitched it as GamKeto, which my company's still GamKeto LLC. HomeTeamGamedev.com is our service, but GamKeto talked about our video courses and stuff. And back then, our video courses had 30,000 people who took them. That was where we were at back then, 30,000 people. Since then, 300,000 people have gone through our courses. And so we're helping people at scale. We've helped more than 10x the people we had helped back then, and we're continuing to grow. And I want to end on a quote by Nolan Bushnell, founder of Atari, who said, "You might learn something playing a game. You will always learn something making a game." The learning we learn isn't just about how to make games better. It helps us solve technical challenges in our lives, helps us solve a creative challenge in our lives. I love that game development gives creative people a reason to practice technical skills, and technical people a reason to practice creative skills, and people who are introverts a reason to have to learn to better coordinate, collaborate, communicate with others, to get people who maybe are a little more shy to learn the benefits and comfort with public speaking, group speaking, presenting, getting proper credit for their ideas by being the person who stands up for it, by being able to see things through, by being able to make long-term plans and follow through on them. We learn so much. We grow so much through game development. And I've really enjoyed finding ways to help share that with more people. HomeTeamGamedev.com is our approach for doing that. I encourage you to check that out. Or if you're a little on the fence about that and you're not quite sure, like I said, GameDevTraining.com is a totally free list you can sign up for, where I'll send you an email every single week with tips that have come from our thousands of hours of training we've done one-on-one with people, what they've learned, what patterns come up, what questions they get, help you get off to a better start. Even if that's all you want from us is just those weekly emails, GameDevTraining.com is the place to sign up. Thanks for hearing me out today. I wish you all the best in the future, and I look forward to playing the games that you're going to make.